You know, after 40 years on this bench, I thought I'd seen everything. But on a cold Tuesday morning in March 2021, a restaurant owner walked into my courtroom who would break my heart and restore my faith in humanity, all at the same time. What she told me about her struggle during the pandemic, what she had lost, what she was still fighting for, I'll never forget it. And when I finally delivered my verdict that day, when I looked at those fines and made my decision, I watched grown men and women in my courtroom wipe away tears. Let me tell you exactly what happened that day, because this is a story about resilience, dignity, and what happens when the human spirit refuses to break, even when the world tries to crush it. But before I tell you this whole story, do me a favor. Hit that subscribe button and drop a comment telling me where you're watching from, because what I'm about to share with you is something that needs to be heard. Trust me, you won't want to miss a single word of this. I've been a judge in Providence, Rhode Island for 40 years now. Every morning I wake up at 6, make my coffee the same way I always have, strong and black, no sugar, and I sit at my kitchen table reading the newspaper just like my father did. He came to this country from Italy with nothing but a suitcase and a dream, worked 3 jobs to put food on our table, and he taught me something I've never forgotten. He said, "Frankie, the measure of a man isn't what he has in his pocket, it's what he has in his heart." I was just a boy then, but those words stayed with me through law school, through my early days as an attorney, and through every single day I've spent in this courtroom. My courtroom isn't fancy. It's not like what you see on television with all that marble and those high ceilings. It's a working courtroom in a working class city, and I like it that way. The people who come through my doors are real people with real problems. They're not criminals, most of them. They're folks who made a mistake, got a parking ticket they can't afford, missed a court date because they were working 2 jobs. These are my neighbors. These are people like my father was. That particular morning, I remember walking into the courthouse at 8:15 like I always do. Christina, my court clerk, she's been with me for 23 years now. She was already there with my coffee waiting. She knows me better than I know myself sometimes. She looked at me that morning and said, "Judge, we've got a full docket today. A lot of pandemic-related cases." I nodded, took my coffee, and went into my chambers to review the files. I had no idea that one of those cases would stay with me for the rest of my life. It was March of 2021, and we were just starting to come out of the worst of COVID-19. The city had been locked down for a year. Businesses had closed. People had lost everything. I had seen the effects in my courtroom every single day. Good people, hardworking people, coming in with violations they never would have gotten before, health code violations because they couldn't afford to fix things, occupancy violations because they were desperate to serve more customers to stay afloat, parking violations because they were working such long hours they forgot to move their car. I sat at my desk that morning going through the case files, and I felt the weight of it all. Each file represented someone's struggle, someone's pain. I've always taken this job seriously, but during the pandemic it felt different. I felt like I was seeing the absolute worst that life could throw at people, and I was supposed to be the one deciding whether to make it even harder for them. At 9 o'clock sharp, I walked into my courtroom. I looked out at the gallery, and I saw maybe 30 people sitting there, all wearing masks, all spaced apart like the rules required. I could see the worry in their eyes even behind those masks. I could feel the tension in the room. These people were scared of the virus, scared of losing their businesses, scared of what I was going to say to them. I sat down at my bench, arranged my papers, and I took a deep breath. I said a little prayer like I always do before I start. I asked God to give me wisdom, to help me be fair, to help me see the humanity in every person who stands before me. Then I nodded to Christina, and we began. The first few cases that morning were straightforward. A parking violation from a nurse who had been working double shifts at the hospital. I looked at her tired eyes and I dismissed it immediately. I told her, "You're out there saving lives. The least I can do is take care of this ticket." She started crying right there, and I had to look away for a moment because I felt tears coming to my own eyes. Then there was a young father who had gotten a citation for his business being open past the allowed hours. He explained to me that he was trying to serve takeout orders, that he was just trying to feed his family. I could see the desperation in his face. I reduced his fine to almost nothing and set up a payment plan he could actually afford. He thanked me 3 times before he left. But it was the third case that morning that changed everything. Christina called the name, and I looked down at my file. Maria Santos, owner of Santos Family Restaurant. Multiple violations, health code, occupancy, operating without proper permits during the shutdown. The fines totaled almost $15,000. I looked up from the file and I watched her walk in. She was a small woman, maybe 5 feet tall, probably in her early 50s. She was wearing a simple dress, nothing fancy, and she was carrying a folder that looked like it was about to burst open with papers. What struck me immediately was her face. Even behind the mask, I could see the exhaustion. Her eyes were red like she hadn't slept in days, or maybe like she'd been crying. Her hands were shaking as she stood before my bench. I introduced myself, even though I'm sure she knew who I was. I always do that. I want people to know that I see them as human beings, not just case numbers. I said, "Good morning, Mrs. Santos. I'm Judge Caprio. I've reviewed your file here, and I see you're facing some serious fines. Before we begin, I want to hear from you. Tell me what happened. Tell me your story." She looked up at me, and I saw her eyes fill with tears. She took a deep breath, and when she started talking, her voice was so quiet I had to lean forward to hear her. She said, "Your Honor, I don't know where to start. I've owned Santos Family Restaurant for 22 years. My husband and I, we started it with nothing. We saved every penny. We worked 7 days a week. We built something we were proud of." I nodded at her to continue. I could already feel something in my chest, that feeling I get when I know I'm about to hear something that's going to affect me deeply. She went on, she said, "When the pandemic hit, when they told us we had to close down, we tried to follow every rule. We really did. But Your Honor, I have 3 employees who depend on me. They have families, they have children, and I have my own daughter in college. The loans came due, the rent didn't stop, the bills kept coming even though we had no customers." I watched a tear roll down her cheek, and she quickly wiped it away. She said, "I tried to get the emergency loans, the PPP loans, all of it. I filled out the applications. I waited on hold for hours. I did everything they told me to do, but nothing came through. Weeks went by, then months, and we were drowning. We were losing everything we had spent 22 years building." I felt my jaw tighten. I had heard this story before, too many times. Good people doing everything right and still getting crushed by circumstances beyond their control. She continued, and her voice got stronger, more determined. She said, "So I made a decision. I decided I couldn't let my restaurant die. I couldn't let my employees lose their jobs. I opened for takeout. I know I wasn't supposed to. I know I didn't have all the right permits at that exact moment because the city offices were closed, and I couldn't get anyone on the phone to help me. But Your Honor, I was careful. I wore gloves. I wore a mask. I sanitized everything. I never let customers inside. It was just takeout through the front door. I listened to every word. I didn't interrupt. I've learned over 40 years that sometimes people just need to be heard. They need to know that someone in authority actually cares about what they're going through." She said, "Then the inspectors came. They were just doing their job, I understand that. But they gave me violation after violation, and then I got overwhelmed. I missed a court date because I was at the hospital. My husband, he had COVID. He almost died. I was sitting in that hospital room wondering if I was going to lose him, and I completely forgot about the court date. That's when more fines came, and now I'm standing here with $15,000 in fines. And Your Honor, I don't have $15,000. I barely have $1,500. She opened her folder and pulled out papers, and I could see they were bills, notices, documents. She said, "I brought everything. I brought my bank statements. I brought the loan applications that got denied. I brought the hospital bills from my husband's care. I brought everything because I want you to know I'm not a bad person. I'm not trying to break the law. I was just trying to survive. I sat there looking at this woman, and I felt something I've felt thousands of times in this courtroom, but it never gets easier. I felt the absolute injustice of a system that sometimes punishes people for the crime of being human, for the crime of trying to survive in impossible circumstances. I said to her, and I kept my voice gentle, "Mrs. Santos, how is your husband now?" She looked up at me, and I saw surprise in her eyes, like she wasn't expecting me to ask about that. She said, "He's better, Your Honor. Thank you for asking. He's still weak, but he's better. He's back at the restaurant with me now. We're trying to rebuild." I asked her, "And your daughter? You said she's in college?" Another tear rolled down her cheek. She said, "She's at Providence College. She's studying to be a teacher. She's on scholarship, thank God, but we still have to help her with living expenses. She wanted to drop out, wanted to come home and help us at the restaurant, but I told her no. I told her education is the one thing nobody can take from you." Now let me pause here for just a second. I need to ask you something. Have you ever met someone who just radiates goodness? Someone who's been beaten down by life but refuses to lose their dignity, refuses to stop caring about others even when they're suffering themselves? Leave me a comment because I actually read them. And if you're enjoying this story, hit that like button for me. I looked down at the file again. $15,000 in fines. I looked at the violations. Most of them were technical, things that in normal times would have been handled with warnings or small fines. But these weren't normal times, and the city was struggling too, trying to enforce rules that were changing every week. I thought about what I should do. I've always believed that the law should serve justice, not just punishment. I've always believed that my job is to see the whole person, not just the violation. But I also knew that if I just dismissed everything, if I ignored the rules completely, I'd be setting a precedent that could cause problems. I made my decision. I looked at Mrs. Santos and I said, "I want you to listen to me carefully. What you did, operating without the proper permits, missing your court date, those are violations of the law. I can't pretend they didn't happen. But I can look at why they happened. I can look at who you are and what you are facing." I watched her face. She was bracing herself, waiting for the hammer to fall. I said, "I've been doing this job for 40 years. I've learned to tell the difference between someone who's trying to get away with something and someone who's trying to survive. You're not a criminal, Mrs. Santos. You're a small business owner who got caught in an impossible situation. You were trying to save your livelihood and take care of people who depended on you." I picked up my pen, and I started going through the violations one by one. I said, "This health code violation, I'm dismissing it. You weren't operating a full restaurant. You were doing takeout, and you took precautions. This occupancy violation, dismissed. Nobody was occupying your restaurant except you. These permit violations, I'm going to reduce these substantially because the city offices were closed and you couldn't get help even when you tried." I watched her face change. The fear started to fade, replaced by something like hope. I continued. I said, "And this fine for missing your court date, I'm eliminating it entirely. Your husband was in the hospital fighting for his life. No judge with a conscience would punish you for being at his bedside." I did the math quickly in my head. I said, "Your total fines, I'm reducing them from $15,000 to $1,200, and I'm giving you 18 months to pay it with no interest. That's $66 a month. Can you manage that?" She stood there for a moment, and I think she was in shock. Then she started crying, really crying, and she said, "Yes, Your Honor. Yes, I can manage that. Thank you. Thank you so much." I said to her, "Mrs. Santos, you go back to your restaurant. You take care of your husband. You support your daughter's education. You keep being the good person you obviously are. And you remember that there are people in this city who see you, who recognize your struggle, and who believe in you." She was crying so hard she could barely speak, but she managed to say, "God bless you, Your Honor. I will never forget this, never." I watched her walk out of my courtroom, and I had to take a moment. I took off my glasses and rubbed my eyes. Christina, my clerk, she was wiping away tears too. Even the court officer, a tough guy who's been in law enforcement for 30 years, he was looking away, trying to compose himself. But the morning wasn't over. I had more cases to hear, and the next one was going to be very, very different. I looked down at my docket, and I saw the next name. Richard Morrison, owner of Morrison's Grill. Multiple violations during pandemic. Fines totaling $8,000. I remembered seeing this file earlier and thinking it was similar to Mrs. Santos's case. I had no idea how wrong I was. Christina called his name, and I looked up to see who was walking in. A man in his mid-40s entered my courtroom, and everything about him was different from Mrs. Santos. He was wearing an expensive suit, looked like it cost more than most people make in a month. He had a leather briefcase that probably cost $500, and he walked in with this attitude, this swagger, like he owned the place. But that wasn't what bothered me. What bothered me was what I saw him do as he walked past the gallery. Mrs. Santos was still there, sitting in the back, probably trying to compose herself after our emotional exchange. This man, Morrison, he looked at her, and I saw him smirk, actually smirk, like her pain was amusing to him. I felt something shift in my chest. I've been doing this long enough to trust my instincts about people, and my instincts were telling me that this was not going to be like the previous case. He stepped up to the podium, set down his briefcase, and before I could even introduce myself, he looked at his watch. Actually looked at his watch, like he had somewhere more important to be. I said, keeping my voice level, "Good morning, Mr. Morrison. I'm Judge Caprio. I've reviewed your file, and I see you're here regarding violations at your restaurant during the pandemic." He barely made eye contact with me, he said, and his tone was casual, almost dismissive. "Yeah, Judge, I am. Look, I'm a busy man. I've got a restaurant to run. Can we make this quick?" I felt my eyebrows go up. In 40 years, I've had people be nervous, scared, angry, sad. But casual dismissiveness, that's rare. I said, "Mr. Morrison, this is a court of law. We'll take whatever time is necessary to address these charges properly. Do you understand that?" He shrugged, actually shrugged. He said, "Sure, whatever. What do you need to know?" I looked down at his file and I started reading the violations. Operating at full capacity during restricted periods. No safety protocols in place. No masks required for staff. Multiple warnings from health inspectors that were ignored. Continued operation after being ordered to cease. The list went on and on. I looked up at him and I said, "Mr. Morrison, these are serious violations. During the pandemic, these restrictions weren't just bureaucratic red tape. They were put in place to save lives. Can you explain to me why you chose to ignore them?" He leaned on the podium, completely relaxed, and he said something that made my blood run cold. He said, "Look, Judge, I've got to be honest with you. This whole pandemic thing was blown way out of proportion. My customers wanted to eat in my restaurant. I wanted to serve them. That's how business works, supply and demand. I wasn't going to let some politician tell me I couldn't run my business the way I wanted to." I sat back in my chair. I couldn't believe what I was hearing. I said, "Mr. Morrison, are you telling me you didn't believe the pandemic was serious?" He waved his hand dismissively. He said, "I'm saying it wasn't as serious as they made it out to be. Yeah, some old people got sick. That's unfortunate. But shutting down the entire economy, destroying businesses, that was an overreaction. I did what I thought was right for my business. I felt my jaw tighten. I thought about Mrs. Santos, whose husband had almost died from COVID. I thought about the nurse I'd seen earlier that morning who'd been working double shifts trying to save lives. I thought about all the people who had lost loved ones, who had suffered, who had sacrificed. I said, and I had to keep my voice controlled, "Mr. Morrison, people died. Over 500,000 Americans died from this virus. Healthcare workers risked their lives every day. Families were torn apart. And you're telling me it was an overreaction?" He shrugged again. That shrug. I'll never forget it. He said, "I'm just giving you my opinion, Judge. You asked me to explain. I'm explaining." I looked at the violations again. I said, "It says here you were warned multiple times by health inspectors. They came to your restaurant and told you to implement safety protocols. You refused. Can you explain that?" Now he actually smiled. He said, "Those inspectors were kids fresh out of college who didn't know the first thing about running a restaurant. I've been in this business for 20 years. I didn't need some 25-year-old with a clipboard telling me how to do my job. I said they were city officials doing their job, trying to keep people safe. He said, and I heard the condescension in his voice, "Judge, with all due respect, I know my customers. They weren't worried about it. They wanted to enjoy a meal in a nice restaurant. I gave them what they wanted. That's good business." I'm going to be honest with you. At this point, I was struggling to keep my composure. If you've ever felt that frustration watching someone show complete disregard for other people's safety and well-being, you know what I'm talking about. Hit that like button if you're still with me, and make sure you're subscribed, because what happens next, I never expected in my entire career. I decided to try a different approach. I said, "Mr. Morrison, let me ask you something. Did any of your employees get sick? Did any of your customers get sick that you know of?" He thought for a moment. He said, "A couple of my servers got it. They were out for a week or two. And yeah, I heard that a few customers might have gotten it, but you can't prove they got it at my restaurant. They could have gotten it anywhere." I said, "But you didn't even try to prevent it. No masks, no distancing, no safety measures at all." He said, and this is what really got to me, Judge, "I'm running a business, not a hospital. If people wanted to stay home and hide under their beds, that was their choice. My customers made the choice to come to my restaurant. That's on them, not on me." I had to take a breath. I had to remind myself that I'm a judge, that I need to be professional, that I can't let my personal feelings interfere with justice. But I'm also human, and I'm also someone who believes that we have a responsibility to care for each other. I said, "Mr. Morrison, the law doesn't see it that way. The health orders were clear. You chose to violate them repeatedly. You put people at risk. The fines you're facing, $8,000, they reflect the seriousness of your violations." Now he looked interested. He straightened up a little and he said, "8,000? Okay, let's talk about that. I'm willing to pay, but I think we can negotiate here. What if I pay $4,000 today? We call it even." I stared at him. I said, "Mr. Morrison, this isn't a negotiation. This is a court of law. You violated health orders during a pandemic. There's no negotiating." He actually laughed, not a nervous laugh, but a confident, almost amused laugh. He said, "Come on, Judge, everything's negotiable. I'm a businessman. You're a businessman. Well, you're a judge, but you know what I mean. Let's work something out here," I said, and I could hear the edge in my own voice. "I am not a businessman, Mr. Morrison. I'm a judge. This courtroom is not a marketplace. You don't get to bargain your way out of consequences for endangering public health." He looked at me, and I saw the smile fade from his face. He said, his tone harder now, "Look, I'll pay the $8,000 if that's what you want. I can write you a check right now. It's not a big deal for me. I make that in a weekend." And there it was, the thing that really showed me who this man was. It wasn't about right or wrong for him. It wasn't about taking responsibility or understanding the impact of his actions. It was about money. He thought he could just write a check and make it all go away. I said, "Mr. Morrison, this isn't about your ability to pay. This is about your attitude. This is about the fact that you show no remorse, no understanding of how your actions affected others." He said, "What do you want me to do, Judge? You want me to cry? You want me to beg? I did what I did. I'd probably do it again. I'm just being honest with you." I sat there looking at him, and I thought about Mrs. Santos. I thought about how she had cried, how she had shown me every document proving she tried to do the right thing, how she had talked about her employees and her daughter and her husband in the hospital. And here was this man who had deliberately broken the rules, who had endangered people, and he was standing in my courtroom acting like it was all a game. I was about to respond when something happened that I'll never forget. I heard a voice from the back of my courtroom. Mrs. Santos was still sitting there, and she stood up. She said, "Excuse me, Your Honor?" I looked at her. I said, "Yes, Mrs. Santos." She said, and her voice was shaking but determined, "I'm sorry to interrupt, but I was sitting here listening, and I just need to say something. I need this man to know what people like him did to people like me." I should have told her to sit down. That's the proper procedure. But something in me, some instinct, told me to let her speak. I said, "Go ahead, Mrs. Santos." She looked directly at Morrison. She said, "You and your fancy suit and your expensive briefcase. You think the rules don't apply to you. You think you can do whatever you want because you have money. But while you were serving full dining rooms and making money, people like me were losing everything trying to follow the rules. My husband almost died. I almost lost my business that took 22 years to build, and you're standing there acting like it's all a joke." Morrison looked at her, and I saw irritation cross his face. He said, "Lady, I don't know who you are, but my business decisions are none of your business." She said, "Your decisions affected all of us. Every person who broke the rules made it harder for those of us who followed them. Every time someone like you ignored the health orders, the pandemic lasted longer. More people got sick. More people died. You don't get to pretend your actions only affected you." I watched Morrison's face turn red. He said, "You know what, Judge? I don't have to stand here and be lectured by some random person in the gallery. Are we done here?" Before I could respond, Mrs. Santos said one more thing. She said, "I hope you never know what it's like to watch someone you love struggle to breathe. I hope you never have to make the choice between following the rules and feeding your family. I hope you never understand what real struggle is, because clearly you don't now." Then she sat down, and the courtroom was completely silent. You could have heard a pin drop. I looked at Morrison. I said, "Mr. Morrison, you asked if we're done here. Not quite. I've heard enough to make my decision. The fines against you total $8,000. I'm not reducing them, not one penny. You'll pay the full amount within 30 days. He said, "Fine, whatever. Can I go now?" I said, "No, you can't, because I'm not finished. I'm also ordering you to complete 40 hours of community service. You'll volunteer at a local food bank that served people during the pandemic, people who lost their jobs, who couldn't feed their families, who were affected by the very situation you treated so dismissively." His face went even redder. He said, "You can't be serious." I said, "I'm completely serious. And Mr. Morrison, let me tell you something. In 40 years on this bench, I've seen thousands of people. I've seen people at their worst and at their best. I've seen people who made terrible mistakes but showed genuine remorse. I've seen people who had nothing but maintained their dignity. And I've seen people like you who have everything but act like they owe nothing to the community they're part of." He started to interrupt, but I held up my hand. I said, "I'm not finished. You came into this courtroom thinking you could throw money at this problem and make it go away. You showed no respect for the law, no concern for public health, and no empathy for the people whose lives were affected by this pandemic. That tells me everything I need to know about your character." I could see his hands clenching into fists. He said, "This is outrageous. I want to appeal this." I said, "That's your right. But until this is resolved, you'll comply with my order. The $8,000, the 40 hours of community service, all of it, do you understand? Before I tell you what happened next, let me ask you this. Do you think I was too harsh on him or not harsh enough? I'm genuinely curious what you think. And here's another question for you. If you were in my position, what would you have done? Would you have shown mercy or delivered justice? Leave me a comment below, because I read every single one." Morrison grabbed his briefcase and he said, "This is ridiculous. You're going to hear from my lawyer." I said, "I'm sure I will. Christina will provide you with all the documentation you need for your appeal. But Mr. Morrison, let me tell you something before you go. My father came to this country with nothing. He worked 3 jobs. He never asked for special treatment. He never thought he was above anyone else. He taught me that character is what you do when nobody's watching, and that respect is something you show everyone regardless of their station in life. You could learn something from men like my father." He turned and walked out, and I could hear him muttering under his breath. The door closed behind him, and I sat there for a moment trying to collect myself. That's when something unexpected happened. The people in the gallery, the other defendants waiting for their cases, they started clapping. Actually clapping right there in my courtroom. I banged my gavel gently. I said, "Please, no applause in the courtroom. We have more cases to hear," but I appreciated the sentiment, and I could feel that the energy in the room had shifted. People had seen that the law applies to everyone, that wealth doesn't buy you immunity from consequences. Mrs. Santos was still sitting in the back, and she caught my eye. She nodded at me, and I nodded back. No words were necessary. We both understood something important had happened. I continued through my docket that day. I heard a dozen more cases. Each one was a story, a life, a struggle. I tried to treat each person with dignity and fairness. Some I was tough on, some I showed mercy to, but I tried to see each person as an individual, not just a case number. But I couldn't stop thinking about Morrison and Mrs. Santos. The contrast between them was so stark. Both owned restaurants. Both faced challenges during the pandemic, but one had tried to do the right thing despite impossible circumstances, and the other had deliberately chosen to ignore the rules because he felt they didn't apply to him. That evening I went home and I told my wife about the day. I've been married to her for 48 years, and she knows me better than anyone. She listened to the whole story, and when I finished, she said something that stuck with me. She said, "Frank, you did the right thing. But you did more than that. You showed that woman that someone saw her struggle, that someone recognized her dignity. That's worth more than any reduction in fines." I thought about that. She was right. Sometimes justice isn't just about the verdict or the punishment. It's about recognition. It's about seeing people for who they really are. 3 weeks went by, and I had mostly moved on from that day. I had hundreds of other cases, other people, other stories. But then something happened that brought it all back. I was in my chambers one afternoon when Christina knocked on my door. She said, "Judge, there's someone here to see you." I asked who it was, and she smiled. She said, "It's Mrs. Santos. She brought something for you." I told Christina to send her in, and a moment later, Mrs. Santos walked into my chambers. She was carrying a large shopping bag, and she looked nervous. She said, "Your Honor, I hope it's okay that I came by. I wanted to thank you properly." I stood up and shook her hand. I said, "Mrs. Santos, you didn't need to do that. I was just doing my job." She said, "No, it was more than that. You listened to me. You saw me as a person, not just a case. And because of what you did, because you reduced those fines, I was able to keep my restaurant open. We're making it. We're actually going to make it." I felt a warmth in my chest. This is why I do this job. For moments like these. I said, "I'm so glad to hear that. How's your husband?" She smiled. She said, "He's doing much better. He's back in the kitchen cooking every day. And my daughter, she's finishing her semester with good grades. She says she wants to be a teacher who helps immigrant families." She said, "You inspired her." I had to look away for a moment because I felt tears coming to my eyes. I said, "You tell your daughter that she inspired me. Your whole family did." Mrs. Santos reached into the shopping bag and pulled out a container. She said, "I made you something. It's my grandmother's recipe, pasta fagioli. I remember you said your father came from Italy. I thought maybe this would remind you of home." I took the container, and I could smell the garlic and tomato and beans, and it did remind me of home. It reminded me of Sunday dinners when I was a boy. I said, "Mrs. Santos, this is too kind. Thank you." She said, "It's not enough. It will never be enough for what you did for my family, but it's what I have to give." We talked for a few more minutes, and then she left. I sat there in my chambers holding that container of pasta fagioli, and I thought about what it means to be human. This woman had been through hell. She'd almost lost everything. And here she was bringing me food, sharing what little she had out of gratitude. That same week, something else happened. Christina came into my chambers with a letter. She said, "Judge, you're not going to believe this. It's from Morrison's lawyer. They're dropping the appeal." I was surprised. I said, "They are? Did they say why?" Christina said, "The letter says that Mr. Morrison has decided to comply with your order. He'll pay the fines and complete the community service. No explanation beyond that." I sat back in my chair. I wondered what had changed. Had he actually reflected on what happened? Had something gotten through to him? I wanted to believe that maybe, just maybe, something I said had made him think. 2 months later, I found out I was wrong. I was reading the local newspaper one morning when I saw a story that made my blood boil. Morrison's Grill was expanding, opening a second location, and there was a quote from Morrison himself. He said, "We never let the pandemic slow us down. We stayed open, we served our customers, and now we're reaping the rewards of that decision." I read it 3 times because I couldn't believe it. He hadn't learned anything. He hadn't reflected on his actions. He was actually bragging about the very thing he'd been fined for. He was holding it up as a smart business decision. I felt disappointed, but not surprised. Some people never change. Some people will never understand that money isn't everything, that character matters, that we have obligations to each other that go beyond profit and loss. But then I thought about Mrs. Santos again. I thought about how she had suffered, how she had struggled, how she had maintained her dignity through it all. I thought about the hundreds of people like her I've seen over the years. People who face impossible situations and somehow find a way to stay good, to stay decent, to care about others, even when they're barely surviving themselves. And that's when I realized something. Morrison doesn't matter. Oh, he matters in the sense that his behavior affects people, that it needs to be addressed when it breaks the law. But in the grand scheme of things, in the question of what kind of society we want to be, people like Morrison are not the ones who define us. People like Mrs. Santos define us. The people who struggle but maintain their integrity. The people who fall but get back up. The people who have every reason to become bitter but choose compassion instead. 6 months after that day in my courtroom, I got another surprise. I was invited to speak at Providence College at their graduation ceremony. I don't usually accept these invitations, but this time I said yes because they told me they were recognizing several outstanding students, and one of them was Maria Santos' daughter, Isabella. I attended the ceremony on a beautiful day in May. I sat on the stage with the other dignitaries, and I watched hundreds of young people receive their diplomas. When they called Isabella Santos's name, I saw Mrs. Santos and her husband stand up in the audience. They were cheering and crying, and I felt my own eyes getting wet. After the ceremony, there was a reception. The Santos family found me, and Isabella came up to me. She was a beautiful young woman with her mother's kind eyes. She said, "Judge Caprio, my mother told me what you did for our family. I want you to know that because of you, I was able to finish my education. I'm going to be a teacher. I'm going to help families like mine." I shook her hand and I said, "Isabella, you did this yourself. Your mother's sacrifice, your father's strength, your own hard work. I just removed one obstacle. You climbed the mountain." Mrs. Santos hugged me and she whispered in my ear, "You saved us. You'll never know how much you saved us." But she was wrong. I did know, because she saved me too. She reminded me why I do this job. She reminded me that fairness matters, that compassion matters, that seeing people as human beings and not just case numbers matters. Now I want to tell you something else that happened, something I didn't expect. About a year after that day in my courtroom, I got a phone call from a social worker at a local food bank. She said, "Judge Caprio, I need to tell you about someone who's been volunteering here, a man named Richard Morrison." I was surprised. I said, "Morrison's been doing his community service. I figured he'd do the minimum required and disappear." She said, "That's the thing, Judge. He finished his 40 hours months ago. But he's still coming. He comes every Saturday morning. He serves meals to people who lost their jobs, who are struggling. And Judge, something's different about him. He talks to people. He listens to their stories." I didn't know what to say. I asked, "Has he said anything about why he keeps coming?" The social worker said, "Last week I asked him that exact question. He said something that surprised me. He said he needed to understand something. He said he'd spent his whole life thinking success was about money and business, but he was starting to realize he'd missed something important." I sat there holding the phone, and I felt something unexpected. Hope. Maybe people can change. Maybe it takes longer for some than others. Maybe Morrison needed to see real struggle up close, needed to hear real stories from real people before he could understand what Mrs. Santos had tried to tell him that day in court. I don't know if Morrison fully changed. I don't know if he ever truly understood the impact of his actions during the pandemic. But I know he kept volunteering, and that's something. It's a start. You know what keeps me doing this job after 40 years? Moments like these. Seeing that people are complicated, that justice isn't always simple, that sometimes the best we can do is plant a seed and hope it grows. If this story is restoring your faith in justice, if it's showing you that the law really can work for real people, show me by hitting that subscribe button and that like button. Share this with someone who needs to see it. I think about that day often. I think about the contrast between those two people who came before me. Mrs. Santos, who had so little but gave so much. Morrison, who had so much but understood so little. Both of them taught me something valuable, just in very different ways. My father, God rest his soul, he used to tell me a story. He said when he first came to America, he was working at a factory. One day the owner came through, a wealthy man in an expensive suit. My father was sweeping the floor, and the owner walked right past him without even acknowledging he existed. But there was another manager there, a man who had worked his way up from the factory floor. That manager stopped, shook my father's hand, asked him his name, asked about his family. My father said he never forgot the difference between those two men. Both had success, but only one had character. That story applies to what I saw that day in my courtroom. Morrison and Mrs. Santos both owned restaurants. Both faced challenges, but one understood that we're all in this together, that we have responsibilities to each other. The other thought success meant being above the rules, above the struggles that ordinary people face. I've learned something in 40 years on this bench. The law is important, rules are important, consequences are important. But the reason they're important is because they're supposed to serve something bigger. They're supposed to serve justice, fairness, human dignity. When I reduced Mrs. Santos's fines, I wasn't ignoring the law. I was serving it the way it's meant to be served, by recognizing that she had tried to do right in impossible circumstances. When I refused to reduce Morrison's fines, I wasn't being harsh. I was holding him accountable for deliberately choosing to endanger others. Some people might say I was inconsistent. How can you be lenient with one person and strict with another for similar violations? But that's the thing. They weren't similar situations. They looked similar on paper, but when you actually listened to the people involved, when you saw their actions and motivations and character, they were completely different. This is what's missing sometimes in our justice system. We get so focused on treating everyone exactly the same that we forget to see people as individuals. We forget that two people can commit the same violation for completely different reasons, with completely different circumstances, and maybe they deserve to be treated differently. I'm not saying we should ignore the law. I'm saying the law should be applied with wisdom and compassion. That's what Lady Justice is holding in her hands, a sword for justice and scales for balance, not just one or the other, both. Let me tell you one more thing about Mrs. Santos. 2 years after that day in my courtroom, I was driving through Providence and I passed her restaurant. It was dinner time, and I could see through the windows that it was full of customers. There was a banner outside that said, 23 years serving Providence. Thank you for your support. I pulled over and just sat there for a moment watching through the window. I could see Mrs. Santos moving between tables, talking to customers, smiling. Her husband was visible in the kitchen. They had survived. They had made it through the worst pandemic in a century. They had faced fines that could have destroyed them. And they were still there, still serving their community, still being the good people they always were. That image, that sight of that little restaurant full of people, it meant more to me than 1,000 legal opinions or scholarly articles about justice. That was justice in action. That was what it looks like when the system works the way it's supposed to. I started my car and continued home, and I felt grateful. Grateful that I had the opportunity to help that family. Grateful that I'm in a position where I can sometimes make a difference in people's lives. Grateful for this job that lets me see humanity at its worst and its best every single day. So let me ask you this. Do you think I was too harsh on Morrison, or not harsh enough? Do you think I should have reduced Mrs. Santos's fines even more? I'm genuinely curious what you think, and here's another question for you. If you were in my position, what would you have done? Would you have treated them differently? I'd love to hear your thoughts in the comments below. I actually read them, every single one. And if this story meant something to you, if you believe in equal justice like I do, if you believe that character matters more than money, do me a favor. Hit that like button and subscribe to this channel. Turn on that bell icon so you never miss another story from my courtroom. Share this video with someone who needs to hear this message. Someone who's struggling and needs to know that there are people who see them, who recognize their dignity. Someone who believes that fairness still exists in this world. Someone who needs a reminder that character matters more than cash. And check out the next video on your screen. I've got another incredible story from my courtroom that you won't believe. It's about a veteran who came before me with a simple parking ticket, and what happened next restored my faith in humanity. I'll see you tomorrow with another lesson about justice, respect, and what really matters in this life. You know, people sometimes ask me why I still do this job. I'm in my 80s now. I could retire, spend time with my grandchildren, relax, and I do spend time with my grandchildren as much as I can, but I keep coming back to this courtroom because I believe something simple. I believe that every person who walks through that door deserves to be seen, to be heard, to be treated with dignity. Mrs. Santos deserved that. Even Morrison deserved that, as frustrating as his attitude was. The nurse who came in that morning with the parking ticket deserved that. The young father trying to feed his family deserved that. Every single person, regardless of their bank account or their status or their mistakes, deserves to be treated as a human being. That's what my father taught me. That's what I've tried to practice every day for 40 years. And that's what I'll keep doing as long as I'm able to put on these robes and sit at that bench. Because at the end of the day, we're all just people trying to get through life. Some of us have it easier than others. Some of us face challenges that would break most people. Some of us make good choices and some of us make bad ones, but we all deserve a chance to be heard, a chance to be understood, a chance at fairness. That's what justice means to me. Not blind adherence to rules, not treating everyone exactly the same, regardless of circumstances, but seeing each person, understanding their story, and making decisions that serve both the law and humanity. Mrs. Santos taught me that struggle doesn't have to destroy your character. Morrison taught me that success without character is hollow. Both lessons were valuable, even though one was much more pleasant to learn than the other. I'm Frank Caprio. I've been on this bench for 40 years because I believe something simple. We're all equal before the law, every single one of us. Rich or poor, powerful or powerless, business owner or bus driver. That's what makes this country work. That's what makes justice possible. Thank you for listening to my story. God bless you. And remember, respect costs nothing, but it's worth everything. Character isn't something you buy. It's something you build, one choice at a time, one day at a time. And in the end, that's all we really have. Not our bank accounts or our businesses or our possessions, just who we are as human beings and how we treated other human beings along the way. That's what matters. That's what lasts. That's what I'll be remembered for when I'm gone, and it's what you'll be remembered for too. So choose wisely, live with integrity, and never forget that we're all in this together.